There's something almost magical about a film that makes everything look easy. Grease hit theaters in the summer of 1978 and immediately felt like it had always existed, like it was pulled fully formed from some golden corner of American memory. The dancing was effortless. The songs were impossible to get out of your head, and the chemistry between its two leads felt so natural that audiences simply surrendered to it. But behind that breezy, sun-soaked surface was production riddled with uncertainty, last-minute decisions, unexpected obstacles, and creative gambles that could have unraveled everything at any moment. The story of how Grease made it to the screen is, in many ways, just as dramatic as anything that happens in the film itself. It began, as so many Hollywood stories do, with a stage phenomenon that nobody quite knew how to handle. The original theatrical production of Grease opened off-Broadway in 1971 and quickly found its way to the main stage, where it ran for over 3,300 performances and became one of the longest-running shows in Broadway history at the time. The energy in those theaters was undeniable. Audiences loved it, critics acknowledged its infectious appeal, and Hollywood inevitably came calling. But acquiring the rights and actually turning the show into a movie proved far more complicated than simply writing a check. Multiple producers and creative teams circled the project with competing visions, and it took years before Paramount Pictures finally secured the property and brought in producer Alan Carr and director Randall Kleiser to figure out what the film version should actually be. The challenge they faced was a genuine one. By the late 1970s, Hollywood had largely soured on musicals. A string of expensive, bloated productions had underperformed badly enough that studio executives had essentially written the genre off as a relic of an earlier era. A nostalgic musical set in the 1950s, aimed at an audience that had grown up on gritty, realistic cinema, seemed like exactly the kind of project that should have stayed on stage where it belonged. The filmmakers understood this skepticism and made a series of deliberate choices to counteract it. They softened the rougher edges of the stage show, commissioned new original songs to freshen the material, and leaned hard into a visual style that was less a recreation of the 50s and a fantasy of them. Warm California light replaced Chicago grit. Palm-lined streets replaced urban corners. The world they built on screen was the 50s as people wished they had been, and that dreamy quality turned out to be exactly what audiences were hungry for. When the film opened in June of 1978, nobody in the industry was quite prepared for what happened next. Industry projections had been modest at best. A musical with a period setting was expected to appeal to a narrow slice of the audience, maybe older viewers feeling nostalgic, and a few devoted fans of the stage show. Instead, Grease exploded into cultural conversation with a force that left studios scrambling to understand what they were witnessing. The film earned nearly $400 million worldwide against a production budget of roughly $6 million, making it one of the most profitable films of the entire decade and the highest-grossing musical ever made at that point in history. What stunned observers was how completely the film had shattered demographic expectations. Teenagers flooded theaters drawn by John Travolta's star power fresh off Saturday Night Fever and by Olivia Newton-John's enormous radio presence. But adults came too, charmed by the nostalgia and the music. Families, couples on dates, and repeat viewers kept filling seats week after week, turning a summer release into a genuine cultural event. Overnight, the film didn't just make money. It completely rewrote how Hollywood thought about the musical genre, and the ripple effects will be felt for decades. One of the smartest decisions the marketing team made came before a single ticket was ever sold. In an era when studios relied almost entirely on trailers and print advertising to generate awareness, the Grease team did something genuinely unusual. They pressed promotional vinyl records featuring songs from the soundtrack and sent them out to journalists and radio personalities ahead of the film's premiere. Radio stations began spinning tracks from the album weeks before audiences could buy a ticket, turning the songs into familiar favorites before the movie even existed for most people. By the time theaters opened their doors, listeners across the country already knew the melodies and were emotionally invested in the music. It was a form of anticipation that traditional advertising simply could not manufacture. The strategy essentially pioneered what would later become standard practice in entertainment marketing. Releasing singles ahead of a film's premiere to build cultural momentum is now completely routine, but in 1978, it was a genuine innovation, and it worked with extraordinary effectiveness. Songs like You're the One That I Want and Summer Nights became massive chart hits before most people had seen a single frame of the film, creating a feedback loop where radio success drove ticket demand and ticket demand drove record sales. The soundtrack eventually became one of the best-selling albums of the entire decade, spending weeks at the top of charts worldwide and moving tens of millions of copies. It was proof that a film's music could be more than an accompaniment. It could be the primary engine of the entire promotional campaign. Behind the camera, the casting process carried its own shared drama. The role of Danny Zuko, the leather-jacketed heartthrob at the center of everything, could easily have belonged to someone else entirely. Henry Winkler, already enormously famous as Fonzie on Happy Days, was among the names considered for the part. Winkler reportedly declined because he had no interest in being typecast as another greaser, and that decision opened a door that nobody quite anticipated. John Travolta stepped through it and brought something that transformed the entire film. His dancing ability elevated every musical number in ways the producers hadn't fully planned for. His natural charisma turned Danny from a tough guy cliché into someone audiences genuinely rooted for. He also had real input into the staging of certain dance sequences, working alongside choreographers to shape movements that felt authentic rather than purely theatrical. His casting didn't just fill a role. It fundamentally defined what the film became, giving the story an emotional center it might never have found otherwise. It is genuinely difficult to imagine Grease becoming the phenomenon it did with anyone else in that part. The character of Sandy Olsen presented its own fascinating complication. As written for the stage, Sandy was an American girl, straightforward and uncomplicated in her origins. That changed entirely the moment Olivia Newton-John walked into the process. The Australian singer and actress was an obvious choice in almost every other respect. Her voice was perfect, her screen presence was magnetic, and her warmth came through immediately. But her natural accent didn't match the character as written, and asking her to sustain a convincing American voice throughout an entire film was a practical problem production couldn't ignore. The solution they landed on was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than fight the accent, they rewrote Sandy as an Australian exchange student, newly arrived at Rydell High and unfamiliar with the rhythms of American teenage culture. The adjustment required reworking dialogue and reshaping certain scenes, but ultimately made the character stronger. Sandy's outsider status now came built into her identity, rather than being implied, and her eventual transformation in the finale carried extra dramatic weight because of the cultural distance she traveled. Newton-John's gentle, sincere delivery also softened Sandy's personality compared to earlier stage versions, sharpening the contrast with Danny's carefully maintained cool. What began as a casting obstacle became one of the film's genuine creative strengths, adding a layer of cultural tension to the love story that the original Broadway production had never possessed. While the leads found their footing, other elements of production were quietly being negotiated behind closed doors. One of the film's most emotionally powerful moments nearly didn't make it into the final cut at all. The ballad sung by Stockard Channing as Rizzo, a raw and vulnerable piece about judgment and reputation, called There Are Worse Things I Could Do, was considered by some members of the creative team to be too heavy for a movie that lived and breathed on fun and energy. The concern was genuine. A moment of that kind of emotional weight felt risky in a production built around dance sequences and catchy pop hooks. Cutting it would have kept the pacing consistent and the tone light, but something essential would have vanished with it. The decision was ultimately made to keep the ballad, and that choice paid off in ways that went far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Channing's performance in that scene elevated her character from comic relief into something genuinely complex. It reminded audiences that real emotions were running beneath the leather jackets and bubblegum melodies. It became one of the most remembered scenes in the entire film, and Channing's portrayal of Rizzo drew critical praise that continues to this day for the nuance she brought to a role that could have been played as a flat stereotype in lesser hands. Every dance number that appears so spontaneous and alive on screen was, in reality, the product of extraordinarily careful engineering. Choreographer Patricia Birch designed a routine specifically for the camera rather than for a live stage audience, which required rethinking movement from the ground up. Steps that read powerfully in a theater need to be completely reconceived when a camera is determining the frame. Movements were simplified compared to traditional Broadway choreography, but made more expressive, with facial reactions carrying as much storytelling weight as the footwork itself. The goal throughout was to make audiences feel the emotion of each sequence rather than simply admire the technique, which demanded a very different kind of thinking than stage direction. Every carefree, joyful moment in numbers like the gymnasium dance-off and Grease Lightning was meticulously planned, rehearsed, and calibrated. The illusion of spontaneity was itself a carefully constructed achievement. Birch understood that film dancing needs to feel discovered by the camera rather than presented to it, and that distinction shaped every choice she made throughout the production. The casting of the cameo role of Teen Angel required its own deliberation. The fantasy sequence built around beauty school dropout needed a performer whose very presence would signal a certain kind of old-school glamour, someone audiences would immediately associate with the decade the film was celebrating. Several established names were considered. The role was brief but pivotal, and getting it wrong would have disrupted one of the film's most visually distinctive sequences. Frankie Avalon, a genuine teen idol from the actual 1950s, eventually landed the part, and his easy, polished delivery gave the scene an authenticity that a younger or less culturally specific performer simply could not have provided. His presence turned what might have been a forgettable interlude into a memorable highlight, blending genuine old Hollywood charm with the film's loving tribute to a vanished era. The visual transformation of material from stage to screen was itself a significant creative decision. The original Broadway production had a distinctly gritty quality rooted in real working-class teenage life in 1950 Chicago. Language was sharper, the setting was urban and unglamorous, and the atmosphere reflected the actual texture of that world rather than a romantic version of it. When producers moved the action to Southern California, they weren't simply changing a location. They were changing the entire emotional register of the story. Filming took place primarily around Los Angeles, with Venice High School providing the iconic exterior shots that audiences now associate completely with Rydell High. Warm California light, palm-lined streets, and wide-open blue skies gave the movie a visual warmth that the stage version had never possessed. Everything looked friendlier, cleaner, and more inviting. The 1950s, as depicted in Grease, were never really the 1950s as they were. They were the 1950s as people wished they had been, and that aspirational glow became utterly inseparable from the film's identity. Even the most iconic visual moment in the entire film came with hidden difficulties audiences never suspected. Olivia Newton-John's transformation in the finale, emerging in the legendary skin-tight black pants that defined Sandy's dramatic character shift, required a practical solution that sounds almost comic in retrospect. The trousers were so impossibly fitted that they had to be literally sewn onto the actress each morning before filming could begin. Moving comfortably was barely possible. Sitting down between takes risked damaging the costume. Newton-John had to remain standing for extended periods during a physically demanding sequence that was already exhausting by any measure. The zipper had broken before shooting even started, leaving the sewing solution as the only viable option. Despite all of it, the result was one of the most instantly recognizable costume moments in the history of popular cinema. The original pants were later auctioned for a significant sum, cementing their place as genuine artifacts of cultural history. What looked effortlessly cool on screen was built on discomfort, improvisation, and considerable physical endurance. One of the best-known secrets about the production involves the ages of the people playing teenagers at Rydell High. Virtually none of the actors portraying high school students were anywhere near actual high school age. Stockard Channing was 33 during filming. Olivia Newton-John was 28. John Travolta, the youngest of the central cast, was 23. Several other cast members fell within that range, making the student body of Rydell High arguably the oldest in the history of cinema. The production team worked constantly to maintain the illusion. Wardrobe choices kept silhouettes young. Makeup artists often features carefully. Lighting flattened facial details, and camera angles were chosen to avoid close-ups that might accidentally break the spell. It was a quiet, continuous effort running underneath every single scene. But the trade-off was entirely worth it. Older, more experienced performers brought a confidence and professional polish to their roles that genuine teenagers likely could not have matched, especially in sequences demanding simultaneous acting, singing, and dancing at high level. The performances were simply too engaging for audiences to question, and decades later, the illusion holds as well as it ever did. On set, the atmosphere was close-knit and frequently unexpected. Director Randall Kleiser fell ill during production, dealing with persistent discomfort that made long shooting days increasingly difficult. John Travolta, who had a personal interest in alternative wellness practices, stepped in with an offer to help through methods that fell considerably outside anything a conventional doctor might recommend. The specifics vary depending on who was telling the story, but the gesture became one of the most talked-about anecdotes among the crew for the rest of the shoot. Reactions ranged from genuine amusement to quiet curiosity. Whether the remedy worked remained open to debate, but the incident captured something true about the mood on set. It was informal, warm, and full of the kind of unexpected human moments that make a production feel like more than just a job. The carnival sequence that closes a film, for all its apparent joyous chaos, was one of the most logistically demanding shoots of the entire production. Dozens of performers, extras, and crew members had to coordinate across a sprawling outdoor set packed with rides, game booths, and elaborate decorations. Every element needed to operate simultaneously, while cameras captured the action from multiple angles. Patricia Birch faced the enormous challenge of staging musical numbers within that genuinely chaotic environment, while background extras maintained believable carnival behavior around the featured performers. Each take required resetting dozens of people and props to their precise starting positions, a process that consumed substantial time between shots. The invisible achievement of that sequence is how completely the effort disappears on screen. Audiences experience it as pure, freewheeling celebration, exactly the emotional climax the story required. Nobody watching sees the blocking diagrams, the camera rehearsals, or the hours spent coordinating apparent randomness into precise choreography. That seamless illusion of spontaneity is perhaps the greatest single testament to the collective skill of everyone involved. The film's editing decisions proved just as consequential as anything that happened on set. An additional closing beat was filmed for the carnival sequence, a brief narrative flourish that extended the ending beyond what made the final cut. Editors and producers ultimately concluded that the extra footage disrupted the emotional momentum the finale had already built to a perfect pitch. The sequence ended on the soaring image of the car lifting impossibly into the sky. Pure fantasy, joyful and completely unforgettable. Adding anything after that peak risked deflating the high audiences were riding, and the decision to cut the additional material proved exactly right. Knowing when to stop is as important as knowing what to include, and the editorial team understood that instinct precisely. Not every decision in production was driven by purely artistic considerations. One of the songs originally contained a name reference that became problematic due to events unfolding in the public sphere at the time of filming. The production team quietly altered the lyric, replacing the reference with something less charged, without any public announcement or explanation. It was a small change most listeners would never notice, but it reflected a genuine awareness within the production that even lighthearted entertainment intersects with the real world in ways that demand responsibility. The adjustment was handled with complete discretion, and the vast majority of fans today have no idea the original version ever existed. After the enormous success of the original, a sequel was inevitable, but what audiences eventually received was not what producers initially envisioned. Early concepts focused on continuing Danny and Sandy's story, picking up after the fairy tale ending and exploring their lives beyond high school. The most natural path seemed to be bringing the original cast back to reprise their roles. Scheduling conflicts, contract negotiations, and a creative reluctance to simply repeat the same formula gradually pushed the project in a different direction. The sequel that emerged, Grease 2, was set at the same school but featured an almost entirely new cast and shifted the timeline into the early 1960s. Released in 1982, with Maxwell Caulfield and a young Michelle Pfeiffer in the lead roles, it struggled both critically and commercially. Audiences who had hoped to see Travolta and Newton-John together again were largely disappointed, and box office returns confirmed that the particular magic of the original was not something that could be reconstructed from different materials. It remains one of Hollywood's clearest demonstrations of how difficult it truly is to follow up a beloved film when the heart of what made it special is no longer present. What the original film did for the stage version it had been adapted from was itself remarkable and largely unanticipated. The Broadway production had already completed its initial run and was winding down in cultural prominence when the movie arrived. Regional productions still appeared occasionally, but the first great wave of theatrical enthusiasm had largely passed. Then the film exploded, and suddenly demand for live productions surged worldwide on a scale nobody had predicted. Theater companies across the globe scrambled to mount new stagings, and the revival wave brought with it an unexpected development. Songs written specifically for the film, including Hopelessly Devoted to You and You're the One That I Want, had become so completely associated with the story in the public mind that audiences expected to hear them in stage versions as well. Producers began incorporating these film original numbers into theatrical productions, blending the Broadway and Hollywood versions into a hybrid that gradually became the new standard. This cross-pollination created a self-sustaining feedback loop that has kept the property alive and vital for decades. The film kept the stage show relevant, while live productions continuously introduced new audiences to the story, many of whom then sought out the movie. Few properties in the history of entertainment have achieved that kind of symbiotic relationship between two completely different formats. What the film ultimately accomplished for the musical genre as a whole cannot be overstated. By the mid-1970s, Hollywood had genuinely given up on musicals. Expensive failures had convinced studio executives that the genre was an anachronism, something audiences had simply outgrown. The commercial logic seemed airtight. Then Grease arrived and demolished that logic completely. Its massive success forced the industry to reconsider everything it thought it knew about what audiences wanted. The key lesson wasn't simply that musicals could still be profitable. It was that they worked best when they connected emotionally with broad audiences rather than depending on spectacle alone. Heart, charm, and genuinely great music mattered more than lavish production values. The pathway the film cleared eventually led to a long succession of musical projects that might never have been greenlit without that precedent, and its influence can be traced through decades of subsequent entertainment history. Without Grease demonstrating that audiences were still hungry for song-driven storytelling, the genre might have remained dormant far longer than it did. It didn't just entertain millions of people. It rescued an entire category of filmmaking from what appeared to be permanent extinction. The film has since been preserved, restored, and remastered multiple times to ensure that new generations can experience it with the clarity and vibrancy it deserves. Anniversary editions, particularly those marking the 20th and 40th years since release, gave technical teams the opportunity to revisit original footage, correct color degradation, and rebalance the iconic soundtrack for contemporary sound systems. These efforts did more than simply refresh an aging product. They actively introduced the film to audiences who might never have sought out a decades-old musical on their own, and each carefully timed re-release generated renewed attention and affection. The commitment to preservation has kept the film feeling genuinely alive rather than merely preserved, which is itself a testament to the enduring power of the material. The devotion audiences have shown the film over nearly 5 decades goes far beyond ordinary affection for a favorite movie. Sing-along screenings became a cultural phenomenon in their own right, with audiences dressing as their favorite characters, shouting dialogue at the screen, and performing choreography in theater aisles. Parents who grew up with the film brought their children, who brought their friends, creating a chain of discovery that renews itself continuously without any orchestration from studios or marketing departments. Community theater groups and school drama departments adopted the material as a rite of passage. People don't simply watch Grease. They inhabit it. They make it part of their own personal histories. That level of audience ownership is exceptionally rare in cinema and cannot be manufactured by any promotional campaign. It can only be earned through something genuine and lasting in the work itself. Grease earned it completely, and it has never stopped earning it since. What the film ultimately represents is proof that the most difficult things can be made to look easy when the right combination of talent, risk-taking, and sheer perseverance comes together at exactly the right moment. From a role rewritten around an actress's accent to a beloved song nearly sacrificed on the altar of pacing concerns, from pants that had to be sewn onto a performer each morning to a finale sequence that required military-level coordination to appear effortlessly chaotic, every layer of production carried a story audiences were never meant to see. The magic was real, but it was built on hard work, compromise, and a willingness to take bold creative chances when the easy path would have been to play it safe. Grease wasn't just a movie. It was a result of years of decisions, large and small, that somehow aligned into something that felt inevitable from the first note to the final frame.